Good day, everyone. This is Jenny Ravelo, Global Health Reporter for Devex. Thank you so much for joining us today. We're hosting this in partnership with Novartis for the UN General Assembly. Antimicrobial resistance, or AMR, as many of us refer to it, is an important health issue that doesn't get as much attention. AMR occurs when a bacteria, virus, parasite changes over time and no longer responds to medicines. This makes medicines ineffective and makes it harder to treat an infection. But AMR doesn't get as much attention, even if, according to a 2019 UN report, drug resistant diseases could cause the deaths of 10 million people each year by 2050 globally. And a report in the UK in 2016 estimated that over 700,000 people already die every year due to AMR. But today we're going to break the silence on this silent pandemic. What should we be doing to prevent it? What pharma companies are doing to prevent AMR? And where does it fit in all the discussions happening today on pandemic preparedness? I'm happy to welcome our two distinguished speakers today to shed light on this topic and provide us more insights on what's being done, what more needs to be done to prevent AMR from becoming an even bigger crisis. We have with us Dr. Lutz Hegemann, who is the Group Head of Corporate Affairs and Global Health at Novartis. Dr. Hegemann is responsible for driving Novartis' corporate strategy and integrating global health and environmental, social, and governance matters into the company's core business. We also have with us Mr. Richard Saynor, CEO of Sandoz, a division of the Novartis Group and a global leader in generic pharmaceuticals and biosimilars. Sandoz reaches 500 million patients a year with its portfolio of affordable medicines, including biosimilars and generic cancer therapies, and generates annual sales of $10 billion. Gentlemen, welcome, and thank you for taking the time to be with us for this discussion.
It's a pleasure, and thank you so much for inviting us. Perhaps I just kick things off. I mean, Sandoz and Novartis, we're one of the largest, or certainly Sandoz is one of the largest and remaining manufacturers of antibiotics globally. In fact, we're about to come up to our 70th anniversary of manufacturing antibiotics in Austria. So we have a very proud history, and clearly I always view antibiotics as probably the foundation of modern medicine. They've been transformative in many ways, allow surgery to happen, treat diseases that would have killed only a few decades ago. But they're incredibly precious. And so I think the AMR topic is incredibly important. As you say, it's probably one of the biggest increasing risks to health that we face over the coming years. And what drives that? Well, I guess a few areas. Clearly, overuse and inappropriate use of antibiotics. Manufacturing, how products are made and how the waste products of that are disposed of and managed. And then how we develop new antibiotics for the future, for future generations of our children. So it's a very complex topic. From our point of view, clearly, it's important to think about this from an access term. How do we deliver and bring high quality antibiotics to patients, but also help educate them and healthcare professionals about the right use of antibiotics? Because in many ways, the right use of antibiotics is probably one of the key areas that we can help address antibiotic resistance.
Thank you so much, Mr. Saynor. So, thank you for that overview. But why is it important? We're very much in the middle of a pandemic. Why is it important for us to talk about AMR now?
Well, it's not a new topic, and it had attracted previously, before the COVID-19 pandemic sort of took the central stage, quite a few global health debates. And as you had mentioned earlier, it is a kind of silent pandemic, where we don't see an immediate shift from one day to the next day, but we see gradually problems building up, resistance building up, and we have to act now in order to mitigate those effects to the extent possible. And I think what the COVID-19 pandemic has also shown is how vulnerable even very sophisticated health systems are against infectious threats. And here with antimicrobial resistance, we have still the opportunity to change our approach, to act now, but we cannot afford to lose time.
Do we have a sense of how it is affecting health systems today?
Yeah, I think to Lutz's point, in many ways, it slowly creeps off. It's not something that changes overnight. But you think about where antibiotics are used. pretty much most surgeries in hospitals to treat common infections that very frequently become very routine. So increasingly we're seeing operations becoming more complex, patients having to stay in hospital longer. Clearly outside the general mortality, the morbidity that's associated with that clearly puts a cost on healthcare systems. It's devastating in terms of people's lives. So it has a very real impact, both economically, health-wise, and emotionally on pretty much every part of society and every kind of government and organization.
And I think particularly to build on what you just said, Richard, if we look into health systems globally, then of course we see that the weaker the health system, the more the struggle to keep antimicrobial resistance at bay. I think in most sophisticated health systems we have fairly good principles of antibiotic stewardship, but then when you go into developing countries, very often you can buy antibiotics sort of over the counter without any medical judgment. In many countries you cannot even get the appropriate antibiotic, but you just need to take what is available. And this is where our access approach really tries to make a difference, that every patient gets the appropriate antibiotic at the right time, no matter in which country, in which society they live. And then, of course, also the question of counterfeit medicines, where we have just started a new large initiative to make sure that if patients get antibiotics, they get the real, genuine antibiotic and not a fake medicine that potentially then, of course, further exacerbates their health condition, but also contributes then, by not treating the infection properly, to further development of resistance.
During this pandemic, we've seen people taking medicines without, proper guidance from the medical profession. Has it been more difficult to track, this to make sure that people are, have access to the appropriate antibiotics or to counter, counterfeit medicines?
That's an interesting question. Actually, in some ways, I would argue we've seen the opposite because of social distancing and because a lot of the controls that the governments have put in place. A lot of the low-level minor infections that traditionally people would have taken an antibiotic for are just not happening. So we're actually seeing quite a substantial reduction in the use of antibiotics, bizarrely, over the last year, 18 months. I guess we now have an opportunity, as we think about the world returning back to normal, about the right use of antibiotics, as Lutz says, the right indication, the right antibiotic for the right disease state, and then making sure that patients understand they need to complete their course and follow the physician's advice, rather than seeing these as OTC products or just any other pharmaceutical, because they're not, they're special medicines.
Yeah, and I think you raise an important point here, and that's about educating the patient, educating society, but also in many parts of the world still educating healthcare workers on the appropriate use of antibiotics, which is another area that we are taking on very seriously. We've just started a partnership with the Commonwealth Association of Pharmacists to start that educational process, to enter into a dialogue at the community level to make sure that antibiotics are used appropriately and that their benefit, but also their potential risk, are properly understood.
You mentioned about, the responsible use of antibiotics. I think a large part of the discussion in AMR is really on this, but you also talked about, addressing counterfeit medicines, educating patients and societies, particularly healthcare workers. Is there anything else we should be focusing our attention when we try to mitigate the spread of AMR?
I think manufacturing. So clearly, Sandoz and Novartis work very closely with the regulatory authorities to make sure that we have the cleanest manufacturing processes, to make sure that products don't end up in effluent. We have all our waste products are properly managed. Traditionally, that's been a significant challenge because these are highly complex manufacturing processes, but how you manage that is a big impact on the environment. And then also the other area is clearly development of new antibiotics as those come into countries and to patients. How we manage that effectively, how we find mechanisms to fund that development and make sure that they're used properly to allow the right level of treatment, the right indication, but also that they don't become widespread and then perpetuate the problem even further.
Yeah, I think in the public debate, particularly the latter point that you had mentioned, Richard, the investment into new antibiotics is always being portrayed very visibly. And while without any doubt this is important, I think we need to be very clear that new antibiotics are not going to solve the resistance problem. They are buying us more time, but of course as the use becomes more frequent, as the evolutionary pressure increases, at some point in time there will be resistances as well. But that said, we have had very intense debates here at Novartis, where our focus of course is on the discovery and development of new medicines, how we should best approach the innovation need in antibiotics. And we decided that together with other pharmaceutical companies, but also the Wellcome Trust, the European Investment Bank and others, we created this AMR Action Fund, which will have a total volume of $1 billion US. We've made a very significant contribution here because we believe that our efforts need to be pooled in order to deliver the most promising output. So rather than approaching this within the constraints of our own company, we decided to partner with others in order to get into the discovery of new medicines faster and also to spread the risk a bit more than what we could do with an internal pipeline. Just wanted to mention this element because, of course, it is an important aspect. But once again, it's not the silver bullet, and we need to start by how we manufacture, how we distribute, and how we use our current antibiotics as a true mitigation step towards AMR.
You both mentioned about responsible manufacturing. I'm just going to step back a little, and for our audience who may not be very much privy into the details, can you just tell us how is that helping, mitigate the spread of AMR?
Okay, in many ways. First of all, antibiotics have been manufactured really since the 1940s, and the manufacturing process is complex. But it also means you need dedicated sites. And those sites mean that it's a relatively small number of places that you can manufacture antibiotics, particularly things like beta-lactams and cephalosporins. But traditionally, these were fermentation processes. And so they generate traditionally generated huge amounts of waste, particularly wastewater, waste byproducts. And those invariably contain elements of the antibiotics. And in this case, spreading those around, simplistically, perpetuates AMR. So we're continually investing in technologies, whether new science to develop ways of manufacturing antibiotics either chemically or enzymatically, which significantly reduce the amount of waste, makes that a much cleaner manufacturing process, and it means that then we don't produce waste effluent that potentially can then perpetuate AMR in the environment. So it's one of the single biggest challenges is clean manufacturing of antibiotics globally. And it's also worth noting that Novartis and Sandoz, we're pretty much the only remaining antibiotic manufacturer left in the Western world. And it's important that we understand those critical supply chains to make sure that future pandemics and future health crises, we have access to high quality antibiotics within a European framework.
There's a lot of talk now on pandemic preparedness. Where do you see this discussion of AMR fitting into that?
In many ways, to me, it's the silent pandemic. As you say, it kills potentially up to 10 million people a year, or will do. That level of mortality is pretty much in line with what we're seeing with COVID at the moment. So, it's up there. I think because it creeps up on you, as Lutz says, perhaps we don't feel it a little bit in the same way, but it's there. And I think programs like this, actions that we see with Novartis and with the WHO and with the UN, are all critical to help ultimately educate around the problem, work together to find solutions, and educate physicians, patients, and ultimately payers in terms of how we do this better.
Yeah, I think to build on what you said, I mean, what characterizes truly a pandemic that we need to be prepared for? I think it matters that we have the right science in place, and just COVID-19 shows the incredible advances that we have made in the scientific field by being able to develop and deploy vaccines in just an unimaginably short time period. And the same applies to AMR as well. But it's also about surveillance, it's about the resilience of health systems, and it's about access to medicines. And those themes essentially are key topics that we need to address in the frame of pandemic preparedness, and they are also at the very heart of what we need to do to combat AMR. But in addition to that, I think what we also see with other infectious diseases is that we have lost some traction on infectious diseases that matter to us. If you take drug-resistant tuberculosis, for instance, there was a report just recently from the Global Fund that showed that there is much fewer patients being treated according to guidelines for tuberculosis, which essentially would also then have the risk of driving further resistance, or parasitic diseases. As you had mentioned earlier, this is not just about antibiotics, but about antimicrobials at large. And I'm sure many of our listeners know our engagement that we have in malaria, where we have a very promising pipeline of new candidates, because we also see resistance occurring in antimalarials, and we need to be one step ahead sort of the parasite and the parasite escaping current treatments. And this applies to many other infectious diseases as well. So I would say for pandemic preparedness, the fundamental principles are the same, and those do apply to microbial resistance as well.
Given the chance to address the world leaders at this week's UNGA, what will be your call to action to them?
For me, I think look at the framework in terms of manufacturing principles and processes. Look at education, how we help educate governments, payers, patients and physicians. And ultimately then how we think about access, how we can work with healthcare systems to make sure patients get the right product for the right indication and are supported through that.
I think even on broader terms, I would say we need to look at health as an investment and not as a cost factor. And wherever we can build resilience into the health systems, it's going to help against pandemics as well, because we've seen this across the world. Depending on the maturity of a health system, it was better or less prepared to deal with the fallout of a pandemic. So I think we need to invest now, which again also for COVID-19, I mean the mRNA technology benefited from continuous investments for different indications over 10 plus years, and then the technology was ready to be deployed in the midst of the pandemic. But all of these investments cannot wait until we have the crisis. They need to happen well in advance to build up all of these capabilities and infrastructure to effectively then deal with pandemics.
Health as an investment and not an expense. I think it's high time that our world leaders realize that important topic. So thank you so much, Dr. Hegemann and Mr. Saynor, for sharing your insights on this important issue. And hopefully this discussion will help start more discussions and actions in addressing AMR. Thank you so much, everyone, and please stay tuned for more Devex events during the UNGA.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for having us.